Indigenous Studies, and also a senior instructor in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. I want to welcome you to our joint event. The event is titled, When Will We Be Ready? Shared Responsibility for Indigenous Engagement in Teaching and Learning. This event is co-sponsored by Indigenous Initiatives at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, the UBC Learning Circle, who's doing our technology, and the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, where I work. I want to acknowledge first and foremost that we are meeting on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territory of the Musqueam First Nations people. When I give that acknowledgement, I always like to personalize it and explain what that means to me. Over the last 11 years, I've learned a lot from the Musqueam community, from the territory, from engagement with teaching and learning in this territory, and also being able to live in this beautiful territory. It's taught me a lot about my roles and responsibilities as an instructor, and hopefully that has taught you as well, and that's why you're here. I want to first invite Elder Larry Grant, who's going to give us our welcome from the community, and I'll let him do that. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. This is my privilege to be here this morning to give the land acknowledgement and a welcome to our community. I'm Larry Grant. I'm from the Musqueam First Nation as a Musqueam language and culture consultant, but also I'm the resident elder here at the House of Learning, and I also adjunct professor in the First Nations and Indigenous Language Program, co-teaching the Musqueam Language Program, the introductory course. So, Nasiaya, Ayaslak Konaskui, Tenita Musqueam. Clark says Yuenas, Kepalano, Hokimoto, Kosilak, the Pinas, Amy Natin, Pushpa the Sans Tomo Musqueam. Stay Punis Yuenas, Kepalano, sent something need to follow. To follow for economic, for to stay with 10, to need UBC, to need to Tomo Musqueam. Set something, heal stuff. I tap my own Just want to say thank you and welcome to all of you here at Stuyvesant Hall at UBC on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Huntsman-speaking Musqueam people. As our ancestor, our great-great-great-grandparent, Kepalana, who was here to greet the first Spanish ship under Captain Narvaez and the first English ship under Captain George Vancouver, welcoming them to this territory. I also do this morning and raise my hands and welcome to all of you here at Stuyvesant Hall at UBC on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Huntsman Musqueam people. Our community, our village that we live in, is about 8 kilometers in that direction along Marine Drive. And it's a community that we have lived in continuously for approximately 4,000 years. Our old people have always said that we've been here since forever. The archaeologists, anthropologists, and the Canadian government doesn't believe us. We are the people that have lived on this delta since the last ice age or longer. That's about 9,000–10,000 years ago. So we've been here for many, many, many years, longer than the University of British Columbia. So our language continuum, according to our elders that went before us, it ranged from Point Grey across the water to Howe Sound, up into the Harvey Creek area, then across the mountain, and then down into Port Moody, Quicklum, Casey, and then back down the South Arm of the Fraser River to Stillwater and back this way. But today we live in this community called Musqueam, and it's less than 200 hectares of land that we're confined to. So But just a little bit of our background of who we are as a people, and that we are situated in our traditional lands that our ancestors walked. So wherever you walk on this campus, anywhere between here and Metro Vancouver, our ancestors walked those areas. So that's something to remember that when we're talking about when will we be ready. So it's to understand this is where we're coming from, the years and years of the millennia that we were here prior to Confederation. So, Kalespanti Tiatala, Taspala Kuina, Kuiti, Tanahuel, I Tepe Tiatala. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Larry. For the next welcome, I'd like to invite Janie Liu up to the podium. Janie Liu is the educational consultant for Indigenous, I should say Dr. Janie Liu. Educational consultant for the Indigenous initiatives at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, and she'll provide you some background on the panel.
Thanks, Tori, and thank you, Larry, for welcoming us to this space. As you were talking, I was thinking about when I arrived here as an undergraduate student in the mid-90s, and really was not aware at that time of the long history that preceded UBC being here, and that part of my own journey in terms of my education has been really informed by learning about that, and it's this ongoing commitment, and I'm really grateful to be here on unceded Musqueam lands, continuing this learning. So I just want to take a moment, as Dory said, I work in the Indigenous Initiatives team at CTLT, the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. And I want to thank everyone who's been involved in organizing this event, particularly the Center for Critical Indigenous Studies for your support, Dory for moderating, Larry for welcoming and being on this panel, as well as the rest of the panelists today for joining us to share your knowledge and experiences. The First Nations House of Learning and Vicki George, we're in this really amazing space here, and wanted to thank you for that, and all the work that gets done here in terms of the ongoing work that has happened at the First Nations House of Learning, and being a leader at UBC in that work. We also wanted to thank our other partners, Cole Daly and Cynthia Lung from the UBC Learning Circle. Some of you are joining us by webinar, so thank you for also attending. All of the AV support, and our colleagues at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. We've got lots of great support from our events and communications team. And finally, I'd like to introduce the CTLT Indigenous Initiatives team. We have a couple of work-learn students, Kira Webb and Julia Poisson. Can you wave? And then also my beloved colleagues, Erin Yun, who's an educational consultant for Classroom and Campus Climate, and Amy Perot, who's the strategist for Indigenous Initiatives. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone who is here today. This event is a follow-up to a session we organized in 2017, titled When Will We Be Ready? Integrating Indigenous Perspectives and Knowledge in the Classroom for the Celebrate Learning Week at CTLT. And this event in 2017 was actually a smaller event that featured a panel of non-Indigenous, non-specialist instructors that we had been working with at CTLT to bring Indigenous topics into their courses, what they were doing, sharing their practices, talking about some of the challenges and what they had learned. After this event, we immediately knew we wanted to do a follow-up centering the voices and perspectives of Indigenous and Indigenous Studies faculty members and university leaders. And so this is how this panel formed today. As many of you may be aware, there have been a series of public consultations on the Indigenous Strategic Plan happening here at the Longhouse to inform the development of an action plan to guide UBC forward in implementing that Indigenous Strategic Plan. And I was actually at a consultation here on Monday that was attended by more than 150 faculty and staff. It was the all faculty and staff consultation. And I had this amazing opportunity to listen in that space as a volunteer table facilitator to a number of different people speaking to the ways that the Indigenous Strategic Plan Action Plan could support and guide us as a campus community to take action to transform the university in ways that might align better with the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, the TRC calls to action, and the missing and murdered, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry report calls to justice. As I was listening as a facilitator for this consultation, I also heard many voices express common questions and concerns that our team in our work at CTLT hear often during consultations on Indigenous engagement in teaching and learning. And some of these questions that folks had may be ones that you're also coming into the room with. What is my role as a non-Indigenous person or as a non-specialist in this area? I would like to respond, but what should I be doing? How should I be doing this? What will my Indigenous studies colleagues think of me taking this on? Will they think I'm appropriating their area of expertise? Will I be criticized? What if I make a mistake? And I'm certain also that some of you in the room have been doing some of this work for some time and have great contributions to the conversation. And so you'll see that we have tables set up and we'll be also moving into discussion at some point in today's event. I want to acknowledge that this is not the first time members of the UBC community are asking what should we be doing to address the legacies of settler colonialism at this university. There's been an ongoing conversation and efforts made, and here I especially want to recognize the work and leadership of Indigenous faculty, staff, and students, and those working in the area of Indigenous studies to push these efforts forward. This event is envisioned as an open invitation to do some learning and some work contributing to these goals, and a recognition that we must start where we are. What else do we need to be ready? That's one of the questions. And to provide some dedicated time and space to share our resources, to listen and collaborate, and take up responsibility for engaging with Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in teaching and learning. I imagine most of us are here because we recognize there is a lot of work to do, and we hope this panel and our discussions will give us some information and tools to do that work. Thanks.
Our next person I would like to introduce is Vicki George. Jane has already let us know she's the Assistant Director of Program here at the First Nations House of Learning and a longtime friend. So please welcome Vicki.
Hi everybody. My name is Vicki George, Assistant Director of Programming here at the First Nations House of Learning, and I'm from the Wet'suwet'en Nation, based in Vancouver. I would like to thank Larry Grant for his lovely introduction and welcoming. Thank you so much. Thanks my colleagues here to share our space and time today as we discuss these very important issues. Jeannie mentioned about the Indigenous Strategic Plan. We are currently holding engagement sessions. We've had 5 scheduled, we're done 4 of them. We have another one coming up on November 19th, and it's for the Indigenous faculty and staff. But if you are unable to make any of these engagement sessions, we will have an online survey. In the coming days, we are just in the midst of finalizing it and crossing the T's and dotting the I's on that. And so that is another opportunity for you to participate online and utilize your voice. So the other thing that I really wanted to share too, when will we be ready? This session is so important and ties in beautifully with the Indigenous Strategic Plan in our engagement sessions and how we move forward as a community at UBC. The timing could not be better. It is very fitting, and it was really important for me to be here to represent the First Nations House of Learning. Dr. Margaret Moss, who's the director, sends her regrets. She is out of town currently, and I'm happy to take her place in this capacity. I'd like to also acknowledge Alex Ash. He's our Indigenous Strategic Planning Manager, and he has been helping us immensely and done an amazing job with these engagement sessions. Alex, just give a quick wave. Thank you. So I think that's all I really have to say, other than I'm really looking forward to the safe discussions that we're going to have in this space. And yes, let's begin.
So, as Jamie mentioned, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, I'm your moderator for today's panel. And there's a few things that we wanted to just let you know as we proceed. For the kind of format of the panel, each panelist has been given guiding questions, which are also on your table, to think through some of the issues around mandatory curriculum requirements or any issues about how to best integrate Indigenous knowledge in the classroom. They're going to speak each for a short period, 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll probably have much more of a free-flowing conversation after that. So it's not your usual panel and then Q&A format. We're going to engage you at the lunch period with working through some of the same questions and then inviting you to then engage with the panelists at that time. So, just going through my notes. This event is also, I should mention, being webcast, and we'll try to engage the online discussion as well during the report period. There will be some photography at the event. I think you, as you were coming in, you were told about that possibility. If you do not want to be photographed, just a reminder, you can go to the registration table and put a red dot on your name tag or anywhere it can be seen, and you will not be in any photographs that we distribute after the event. We want to let everyone know in terms of self-care, feel free to move around, use the washrooms. There's from either side of the doors whenever you need to. And you won't be disrupted. It's kind of awkward to come out of the space when everybody's here, but feel free to do so. There's coffee and water and tea over here as well, and you're free to do that. Get those refreshments whenever you need it. All right, so we can get going. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a very short bio. These are very short bios, and they do so much more wonderful things than I can say, so I'm just going to get to it. Obviously, our first speaker is Elder Larry Grant, who was born and raised in Musqueam Traditional Territory by a traditional Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam family. He serves as resident elder at the UBC First Nations House of Learning and as an adjunct professor with the UBC Musqueam Language and Culture Program within the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, and serves the Musqueam people as a language and culture consultant. He is a former band counselor, a grandfather, educator, and cultural practitioner. Our next panelist is Dr. Candace Gala. She's an associate professor in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies in the Department of Language and Literacy Education here at UBC. Her scholarship focuses on Hawaiian and Indigenous languages at the intersection of education, revitalization, and digital technology, and decolonizing and indigenizing the academy to create pathways for Indigenous thinkers and scholars, locally, nationally, and globally. Sitting beside Candace is, my things are out of order, is Gordon Christie, who is a professor of law at the Allard School of Law here at UBC, where he serves as director of the Indigenous Legal Studies program. Professor Christie researches in the areas of Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal title, Indigenous self-determination, and the Crown's duty to consult and accommodate Aboriginal groups. And he just had a new book come out in September, which is with the University of Toronto Press. Sitting next to Gordon is Leah Walker. Leah is the Associate Director of Education at the UBC Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. She has strong kinship ties at Seabird Island. Her life work includes the privilege of leading Indigenous curricular initiatives in the Faculty of Medicine and supporting Indigenous community-focused programs such as the UBC Learning Circle, UBC Summer Science for high school students, and HCAP for Health Administrative Leadership. Next to Leah is Dr. Cole Thrush. He's a settler scholar who was raised in the Treaty Territory of the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe near Seattle, Washington. He is a professor of history and faculty associate in critical Indigenous studies at UBC, where he has taught since 2005. His books include Native Seattle Histories from the Crossing Over Place and Indigenous London, Native Travelers at the Heart of Empire. And last but not least, by any means, is my dear friend Daniel Heath Justice, who is a Colorado-born Canadian citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He is professor of First Nations and Indigenous Studies and English and holds a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literature and Expressive Culture. Please help me welcome our esteemed guest. previously to the introductions, I'll just now turn it over to you and to your thoughts on the questions that were handed to you or whatever it is that you want to contribute in this conversation.
This is this is quite the questions. My experiences with the First Nations and language program what began in 1998, 1997, and moved forward. And I think it has really moved forward in the years that we've had it here at Musqueam and UBC. But I think also that this mandatory curriculum related to Indigenous content in your department or faculty is quite a double-edged sword, I think. What is mandatory curricula for the area? Because in the language program and in the language legislation workshops, there was huge discussion on what language, what dialect will be taught within the school system, which is including the post-secondary institutions. And if there's mandatory curriculum, whose history do you tell? Do we tell the Canadian government's idea of pan-Indianism across Canada when we understand that there are 62 languages across Canada and 34 of them are here in the unceded lands of British Columbia? So if there's 34 languages and 7 language families in British Columbia, which languages do we focus on? Do we focus on the urban individuals in their cultural aspect and their movement away from their homelands into the homelands of the Musqueam people? So whose history are we going to concentrate on? If we have mandatory history programs, why do we not have Coast Salish historian faculty here? Why do we not have Salish faculty in First Nations and Indigenous studies? We have faculty from across Canada, from further up north, and from America. And the American has a different governance system, has a different relationship with the government of the United States. In Canada, there's a fiduciary obligation relationship between Canada and the First Nations of Canada. And Canada is doing everything they can to abrogate that responsibility. And then today we have the UNDRIP legislation on the floor in the legislature of British Columbia, talking about rights of Indigenous peoples. Of which Indigenous peoples are that? So that opens up a whole Pandora's box of issues that many of us are struggling with. We're struggling with the overlap created by the Indian Act and the Reserve Act, and the void created by those acts, by keeping us separated for 150 years, giving us little scraps, creating the differences that many of us are not familiar with, in the sense of, if we go into our Indigenous histories, they're quite different from the written histories of the explorers that were trying to create a legacy for themselves, for personal wealth, personal gain, and this is including the Canadian government and the provincial government. The industrial leaders have helped to create a myth of Indigenous relationship, which they're trying to move forward from today. So mandatory curriculum is something that's opening the doors that I think we're not able to cover all the bases on that. But it's really, really important that I know we're talking about the Indigenous Strategic Plan here at the University of British Columbia. I know it's going to move forward. I know it's being accepted by the Board of Governors, but also to have it enacted is very, very much like the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on the floor of the legislature and also on the floor in the House of Commons, where they allowed it to die because they didn't want to, as far as my opinion is, they didn't want to deal with it because they had to deal with industry, the industrial segment of Canada that controls the majority of things that happen in the Canadian government. We're probably not ready to deal with that. And today we try to deal with that in the provincial level. So unless that's enacted into law and a policy to enact is created, and a policy to have repercussions to it if you don't live up to it. And it's a universal act. It's a very, very universal act. It's the rights of human beings that are being discussed, the rights of people that, because of the doctrine of discovery, legitimizing the overtaking of societies around the world and calling them savages, and to be able to access their resources, human and otherwise, and creating an enslaved environment through that doctrine of discovery. How are we going to move forward if we still have the Pope not willing to denounce the doctrines of discovery and the rest of the world not willing to do that? And those are the first documents created, in my opinion, legitimizing the crimes against humanity. So if we're not willing to deal with that, how do we move forward in a good way? And I know that may not be what we are going to deal with here today, but those are the questions that we need to think about. How do we move forward if the most powerful church in the world still stands by the doctrine of discovery that affects the people around the whole world? So I'll leave it at that because I will probably talk all day. So, thank you.
Aloha mai kākou o wauno o Candace Kalimama o Bihine Kapugala, no Hawaii mai au. My name is Candace Gala and I am from Hawaii. And I wanted to start off by saying mahalo to Elder Larry Grant for such a warm welcome, and you see the sun shining outside, which is beautiful. Just a little bit of context of where I'm working from is the Faculty of Education as well as the Faculty of Arts, but I'll talk about a mandatory course within the Faculty of Education titled EDUC 440, Aboriginal Education in Canada. Do we have any education colleagues in the audience, maybe in the webinar? I see a couple. Great, so maybe this will resonate with you. So coming from Hawaii, being new to Canada, being very familiar what is happening, of course, in Hawaii and with Native American communities in regards to language and cultural revitalization, it was very new to me to be in this space. And so I was hired within education, within language and literacy education, as someone to work with Indigenous language education and revitalization. But I also took on that responsibility of teaching a course in our Bachelor of Education program. It's a 1-year post-bac program, and it's grown to, I believe, 750 plus students. And thinking of the context, there was an accord on Indigenous education that was co-authored by Joanne Archibald in addition to other colleagues, other Indigenous colleagues, in 2010 with the Association of Canadian Deans of Education across Canada. If you know a little bit about our K12 education, there has been a reform within the province of British Columbia. So mandating or requiring teachers to include Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous ways of being and doing into the classroom. So this course started several years ago. So I've been teaching this course, I want to say 5 or 6 years or so. But again, with this program, it's a 1-year program. I teach this course typically during the summer, towards the end of their program, after the practicum. And you think of this course, again, Aboriginal Education in Canada, we would hope that this would be something that our teacher candidates would be able to embed in all of their other courses. So this is one of those challenges that are not only heard by students, but also faculty as well. So when I arrived, I mentioned that I took on this responsibility. I didn't know much about Aboriginal history in Canada, but I also knew that that I should be taking on this responsibility. And I knew that I would be learning alongside many of my students. This was also a risk because I was not tenured, and this is something that has been talked about with Indigenous faculty and junior faculty as well. But again, I took this on as my responsibility, and in my course evaluations, you know, we talk about course evaluations and within it, I mean, very personal kinds of things, but I'm not Indigenous to Canada, I'm not from BC, I talk about Hawaii too much, I shouldn't be teaching these courses. But if you think of our population of teacher candidates, majority of the teacher candidates are not Indigenous. And in fact, we have a Native Indian teacher education program that's been going on for 40 or so years. But within the larger Bachelor of Education teacher education program, we have Indigenous students as well. So it's really important for our students to see that not only Indigenous faculty are teaching these courses, but non-Indigenous faculty are teaching it as well. So this is definitely something we need to see more often. But because many of us who are in this tenure track position are reliant on these maybe teacher evaluations, although, you know, I think we're getting to the point where we're really acknowledging what is being said and how to use that data. some of our Indigenous faculty choose not to teach these courses. And so we have to be mindful of why these decisions are being made, and then who is actually teaching these courses. So it's usually untenured faculty, junior faculty, sessionals, as well as graduate students who are teaching these courses. But again, one of the challenges is the fact that this course is taught at the end of the program. Within a one-year program, the students are quite exhausted. They're also going on job interviews. So really great, exciting time, but also it would be really nice if students were able to embed these knowledges throughout their other courses. One of the challenges with that is this course typically is taught, for me, over a 1 month term. And these are some of the topics that we have to cover. Settler colonialism, residential schools, terminology, which leads to the Indian Act, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, land-placed education, place-based education, language revitalization, responsibility, reciprocity, truth and reconciliation, the calls to action, First Peoples principles of learning, Indigenous pedagogies, protocols, etc. That's just a little of what we covered.
In 1 month?
In 1 month. And I think 2 hours a day. So it's a lot. But one of the other things too is when I first started teaching this course, we would hear comments from faculty as well as our students. Our students going up to faculty in other courses and saying, oh, could we introduce maybe an Indigenous author or maybe a topic around indigeneity? And the response would be, oh, you'll get that when you have an Indigenous professor, or you'll cover that when you take EDUC 440. And so again, it puts all the burden on Indigenous faculty. And you see that, again, not only within the Faculty of Education, but other departments as well, other units. And this isn't a UBC challenge. This is across Canada. So one scholar, maybe we've heard of her, Lenape scholar Susan Dion, she talks about being a perfect stranger. So where you sort of distance yourself from colonial history, but we're actually not so perfect stranger anymore. So these challenges are a Canadian problem, and it's not an Indigenous problem, and we've heard that over time. So how have we come to learn about Indigenous peoples, knowledges, histories, and so forth? So what is shaping our understanding of this? So over the last 5 or so years, I've seen less resistance, whether it's from faculty, from students, but we also need more of us on board. In addition to our Indigenous faculty, there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into teaching these courses. You know, even though I teach a course maybe 2 hours a day, my colleague and I tracked how much time we actually spend on teaching a course like this. It's more than just the 2 hours. So I've seen a different kind of response, but again, we need support not only again from our Indigenous faculty, but our non-Indigenous ones as well. And I hope that that students see me as a sort of model, in that I am, again, not from this place, but I'm learning about the histories, learning how to go about teaching. And again, I'm making mistakes and I'm correcting, whether it's self-correcting or being told. So I think it's how we respond to this, but also it is all of our responsibilities. And so what is your responsibility in decolonizing and transforming our university here at UBC?
Okay, so I guess these mics are sensitive to pick me up. Is that good? I'm being heard? Okay, so I'm sitting up here enjoying listening to the panelists, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief so we can get down to the rest of the group here. I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we have already in place at the law school and what we have in development, and a bit about the context for what's been happening in the last 10 or 15 years. I think it's important. And then a bit about myself. I actually begin by connecting some of my thoughts as I'm listening to Larry and Candace speak about how I do my research and conduct my teaching. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm also not from here. Maybe Larry was pointing to me when he said people from north. I'm about as north as you can get. My family's from the Mackenzie River Delta, Aklavik, Inuvik, Tuk, and those places. And my family is actually, my mom's family is actually from the North Slope of Alaska, came over in the 1930s and 40s into the Delta because of diseases that had reduced the population in that area of Canada at the time. And I agree with most of the, practically everything Larry said. I mean, I'm very conscious of the danger in presenting yourself as an Indigenous person as if you know things about the Coast Salish, the Ho'okaminam speaking peoples, anybody in BC. I'm always very careful not to ever, in my writing or in my teaching, create any false impression that I know anything about the peoples here, because I'm not from here. Everything I've written the last 20 years or so, I point sometimes to things that are happening in other communities, and I'm very careful to make it clear I'm talking about my impression of what's happening in these communities from an outside perspective. And I think that's important to keep in mind as the way business should be done, because I was always told from my perspective that you only speak about things you know about, and if you're not from a people, you don't know them. So what we have going on in law school, we have a lot going on. And let me preface my remarks by saying they'll sound like we have a lot going on, and you'll think, well, how do they get all that done? Well, the law is that place where the state and Indigenous peoples have met. And the law, when you think of the law, you tend to think of Canadian law. There's much more than that, of course. So the laws of the Musqueam, the laws of all the peoples across Canada. But when you go to the Canadian law school the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, and you took courses in Aboriginal law, it was about how the state was interacting with Indigenous peoples. And given that context, and given that before that, the Canadian system applied its laws extremely oppressively to Indigenous peoples, I think the law was really responsible for most of the harm suffered by Indigenous peoples. It makes sense that in the law school setting there would be a sense of a real strong desire to make things better. So there's a reason why I think in the last 15, 20 years, the law school has transformed itself from a very conservative institution, say back in the 60s and 70s, to now being somewhat, I would say, quite progressive. So we have already in place a mandatory course that's been there for about 6 or 7 years in first year on Aboriginal treaty rights. So all students take a course on Aboriginal treaty rights in the first year. I think this is going to have a transformative effect down the road. I mean, the next 10, 20, 30 years, all the lawyers in the province, well, almost all the lawyers in the province, and many of the judges are going to have had this course in first year. They'll have some sense of what Aboriginal treaty rights look like, why they came into being, and so on. That's going to change the thinking in the legal profession, I hope. We're in the middle of putting in place a mandatory course called Crown Settler, let me get this right, Settler Indigenous Legal Relations. I believe it's a working title. That'll be a mandatory course in the first term of first year beginning next September. Now, we don't have this in place yet, but I don't see any barriers to this happening. Faculty Council passed a resolution a few weeks ago, and now it goes through the Senate process. So next September, I'm pretty sure we'll have in place the second mandatory course. And this is directed very specifically at the call to action from the TRC that spoke to law schools. So it's a course that's meant to cover the material that Murray Sinclair thought should be covered in a law school setting. So, and then we also have a bunch of other things going on. We've had an Indigenous Community Legal Clinic for about 25 years in downtown East Side, serving Indigenous peoples in that area of Vancouver. And in the last year or two, there's been movement in expanding outwards across the province to provide legal assistance to Indigenous peoples in other parts of the province. We have a specialization in Aboriginal law, so students can take certain courses, meet certain requirements, and get a certificate that shows that they specialize in Aboriginal law. For the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a cultural competency program running, so people can get certificates in cultural competency. We have 5 Indigenous faculty who are tenured or tenure track. We have several staff, Indigenous staff members. So we have a lot going on. In terms of just a few remarks about the mandatory curriculum, my sense was, because I taught that first year when the mandatory Aboriginal Treaty Rights class came into being, my sense was there was a fair amount of resistance, which was expected. By the 3rd year and the 4th year, when you made that flip, so that at that point there were no upper year students who hadn't been exposed to this course, the resistance really diminished. There's still some people coming into law school with set ideas, some young students who already have ideologically framed opinions about things. But those are usually reluctant to make their expressions, their opinions known. So now we have all students across all years who have this course as part of their program, and they don't see it as something being imposed. It's just part of life in law school. Everybody takes this first year course. You don't have upper years telling them, well, I never had to do that. So the resistance is really diminished. We do have a concern, though, and this is a concern I have with the second course, is this has had an impact on upper year enrollment in courses. Because now everybody takes a course in Aboriginal Treaty Rights. Next year, everybody will take a course in settler Indigenous legal relations. And unfortunately, I think it has an effect of having upper year students think, well, I've seen much of that, I don't need to take any more courses in that area. So that's one of the knockoff effects I think of having mandatory courses. What else can I talk about? I guess I can go on all day too, as Larry goes. I'm going to pass it on to Leah. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be here with you, and Elder Larry, particularly. I'm always am learning so much from you, and I'm always surprised at how much I don't know. And I've been working in the Faculty of Medicine, specifically in developing curriculum, for about 18 years. And the context for mandatory curriculum in the Faculty of Medicine, so I'll just kind of cut to it. And it has been in concert with a lot of the things that have been happening here around the Indigenous Strategic Plan. With that plan checking in on the deans, that has a big impact on, oh, do you have Indigenous faculty? Do you have Indigenous students? What are you doing about this? That actually really helps things along. The other thing that's helped things along is in this province, there's a new First Nations Health Authority. And for most healthcare providers, they have to have some curriculum in Indigenous health in order to practice. All health authorities are responsible for that. And so many people have taken something called SANYAS, which is like cultural competency training, which has had a huge amount of resistance because a lot of people don't necessarily know why they should be taking this kind of content. The First Nations Health Authority also has been pushing and supporting all of the professional associations to sign a Declaration of Cultural Safety, which comes from our New Zealand brothers and sisters, and essentially it's the right to receive safe care. And that is determined by the people receiving the care. And so what that has been really important. And also I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada, who, with all of the deans and all of the associations of all of the 17 medical schools across Canada, the few Indigenous physicians that there have been have come together, and they have developed competencies in Indigenous health that people must meet, or they should meet. So, and as the faculties of medicine across the country are very competitive with each other about who is doing the work and who's not doing the work, it really helps to follow some of the colleagues across the country. So, and the final thing that's helped here is curriculum renewal. So medical students have to graduate with milestones that they have to meet at the end. And in order to meet those milestones, they have to have curriculum. So at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, we have developed, and we've got one person here that is leading that charge, Indigenous cultural safety curriculum. And so medical students, pharmacy students, and other health professional students take this course. It's great. And one of the things that works so well about it, and there's some challenges I have to say, but one of the things that works so well about it is that it's co-taught by an Indigenous facilitator and an ally facilitator. Wherever they are on their journey, being completely honest about where they are on their journey towards understanding the health and well-being of Indigenous people. The challenge is to be honest about that, to accept your shame of what you don't know, where you are in your journey. And as an Indigenous identifying person myself, knowing what I can't answer, what I can only answer what I know about my relationships and my community. So that's a hard place to be because a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that and don't necessarily see the relationship to their profession. Like, what does this have to do? I can just treat everybody the same. How do I do that? And then there are big incidents that happen that drive people, like Brian Sinclair in Winnipeg, and I know many of you know that story, or some of the health indicators that are considerably, the disparities are considerable for Indigenous people. So that is the context for the mandatory curriculum. And my challenge in the curriculum, I just have to say, is a lot of the content is, we work really hard to put content into the Faculty of Medicine curriculum, and sometimes it has to get pulled out because clinical faculty don't have the skills to be able to hold the conversations that we are going to be having today. So the big challenge for us is to be able to hold the space, to have the conversations, to deal with the racism that comes out with the dismissiveness and the apathy. And it needs to be role modeled by the faculty. The students are actually way more woke, if I were going to use that word, than the faculty. And the faculty needs to take, and staff need to take a leadership role that way. So that's what I see where I sit, is the faculty hasn't taken on the curriculum. They have not learned what they need to learn. And yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it there because I know that there's going to be more in the conversation. But Heichka, for listening to that.
So I just want to, start by just thanking CTLT and everybody who set this up. It's a huge honor to be at this table with these colleagues. I'm a historian in the Faculty of Arts, and I spend a lot of time in other scholarly settings, particularly in the US and the UK. And so I want to start with just an acknowledgement of where UBC is in relationship to those other spaces that I often end up in. And this is not to get complacent. It's not to say that what we're doing is enough, but we're sure doing a lot more than a lot of the places that I go and where I spend time. There are some real specificities to UBC and what's going on here, grounded in this place, that I think are really important for us to acknowledge. And I've seen tremendous change over the 14 years that I've been here. So we don't have mandatory courses currently, and I share a lot of the concerns that have been raised by Daniel, by Candace, by others, about having mandatory courses and what would happen in those courses. And the big question for me is who is doing the labor? And that means faculty, but that also means students. What do Indigenous students, for example, have to put up with in a mandatory course? What labor are they being expected to do, and sometimes by faculty. So I think that's really important for us to think about is who would be doing that work, and that's where some of us who are non-Indigenous can step in. In terms of non-expert faculty, I see a lot of interest among people who don't work in the field specifically, and that's all the way from faculty in the first year Arts 1 program all the way up to my colleagues who are teaching graduate seminars in my department, trying to incorporate Indigenous material into those courses, whether it's a historiography course or even just an introduction to the issues through a book like The Inconvenient Indian or whatever. There seems to be a real willingness on the part of a lot of people, but not all, as you say, to engage. And I think that's great. And so there are some points where I think we can do some really good work, including if we are not experts in the field. One is in our syllabus and our citational practice. Who's on your syllabus? Which voices get heard in your class? On the page, in video, or whatever formats, guest speakers, whatever. Really think about the syllabus and what that syllabus is doing in terms of work, who it legitimizes and who it doesn't. That's really critically important. And I think one of the things that I would really encourage, and this really builds on what Leah was saying, is the honesty. And I think moving toward a model not of kind of an opaque mastery of what we teach, but rather transparent inquiry, where we're really honest about not knowing what we don't know, and moving from there. Because there's a real, I would say, onus in this profession to pretend as though you know everything and you're going to defend it against all comers. And I think that's actually the wrong way to approach really life, but this particular kind of material in particular. To have your students know that you're learning with them, that alongsideness that Candace was talking about, I think is really critically important. That pulls back the curtain for students on what the process of learning really is. And that it's not just this black box that someday you get when you get a PhD, that there's actually a lifelong process that's at work here. And what that means is that we have to engage in a pedagogy of discomfort, and not just discomfort for our students, but for ourselves. That we need to be uncomfortable. We should never be comfortable, particularly those of us who are non-Indigenous. We should never be comfortable. I think that's really important. And what that means is that we have to have a really holistic teaching practice. And the problem is that most of us, I would say almost all of us, are not trained in being holistic in our teaching. We're trained to be specialists. We're not trained to care for the whole student. We are not trained to think about the world outside the classroom. We're trained to publish, and sometimes to teach. I would say that I would like us to think about interrupting the provision of data and think about instead building relationships with our students. That it isn't about just downloading information. There are other things going on in these classrooms. And then I would also say, for those of you who are not experts in the field, or who are non-Indigenous more broadly perhaps, to do behind-the-scenes service work. I will say that one of the things I'm proudest of is the year that, or the 16 months that Dory and I co-chaired the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which was here in 2017. And the opportunity to learn through doing that work of, choosing food and organizing the residences and all that kind of stuff. Get on committees where you can do that kind of work, and through those relationships develop some more competency. In terms of my discipline, we were asked to talk about our disciplines. I'll just say that history tends to be a bit behind the curve, to say the least, as a discipline. And here I'm talking again primarily about the US and the UK. It's pretty grim in the UK, to be honest, on Indigenous issues. They don't even teach the British Empire in their schools there, really. And history has a real fantasy of objectivity and neutrality, and a real fetishization of the documentary record, which excludes all kinds of things from what could otherwise be a really expansive sense of the archive. That's changing. There are lots of conversations happening. I spend a lot of time in kind of the early modern era, so 18th century and earlier. There's a lot of conversations going on there. There's a lot of pushback happening as well, though. And the pushback is, I would say, just a fairly elaborate form of white fragility. But it's interesting to see it happening in those academic spaces as well, in book reviews and the like. But I do think history has something to add. I think there's a historical perspective here that is really critically important, and that we began with the acknowledgement of territory. That there are thousands of years of history in this place, and that colonialism is only the thinnest of veneers over that history, over those millennia. And this conversation that we're having about reconciliation and so on is even newer than that. If we're thinking about 10 or 12,000 years in this place, the conversation that we're having today just started. And so I try to remember that when I'm trying to figure out where do we go from here in the big scheme of things. And so one of the things I'll end by just saying that one of the things I try to do in all my classes is make sure that students understand that they are all inside the story, the big story that we're doing here, that we're talking about in my courses, which means they both have the right to speak to these issues, but it also comes with the responsibility to speak to these issues, that both those things are true. And I would say that that's true for those of us who are professors who are non-Indigenous, who are staff who are non-Indigenous. We are inside the story as well. There is no escape. And it's only when you think you're outside the story that you're so in it you can't even see it. And so lastly, I'll just say that to remember for those of us who are non-Indigenous that there are spaces that are not for us. Those spaces are in the past, those spaces are in the present, those spaces are in the future. And we don't have to be everywhere. We have our own spaces where we can do this work. We have our own platforms that we can turn toward these goals. And that's kind of the approach that I try to take. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So a lot of what I had thought I would talk about has been very beautifully articulated already. So I'd like to kind of take up some of the threads and maybe build a little bit on just some of the things that came up early on. And one thing I was thinking is the title, when will we be ready? And I really wonder who the we is here. Because I think it's going to be a very different response depending on who we are and what relationship we have. And I also wonder ready for what. I'm just going to leave those here for a moment and tell a story. So when I was first a graduate student, I was at the University of Nebraska, and I was really struggling about my role. So I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I have very deep and rich roots in the nation, but I wasn't raised in community. My dad, who passed away in April, was phenotypically Native and walked through the world very differently than I have, with light skin privilege. And so I was really struggling with my right to do this work. And I was talking with my supervisor, a really astonishing scholar named Francis Kay, I think recently retired from University of Nebraska at Lincoln, Jewish hippie from New York, also with some Canadian connections. And she was here listening to me talk about, whether or not I had the right to do this work because I wasn't raised in community and all this stuff. And finally she stopped me and said, "Daniel, you're sounding like a white guy." And I kind of like, what? And she said, "White people always say, what are my rights? What are my rights?" She said, "You've got to ask yourself the Indian question. What are your responsibilities if you're going to do this work?" Mm-hmm. And I cite Fran because that was a really necessary thing for me to hear. And then I talked with Dad and with others. I'm like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But I think that for me is one of those fundamental lessons. And of course, it's very sweeping and generalizing. But I was thinking about the questions you've gotten in some of these. In these conversations about what is my role. And I think that also comes down to this issue, what are my rights to do this work if I'm not Indigenous or if I wasn't raised in a community. And I think I bring it back to that question, what is your responsibility here? And all of my colleagues here have talked about that. What are the responsibilities of learning? What are the commitments we're making? What are our responsibilities to Musqueam, to our hosts on whose land we work and who we benefit in all kinds of ways, not just from their generosity, but we also benefit from the things that were taken to expropriate this land for this university. And that's an ugly legacy that we are part of as well. And so we have a huge number of responsibilities in this place and in every single university, for those who are in the webinar, wherever you are, you're on Indigenous land. And there are responsibilities that come from inheriting that legacy. And then that question, what if I make a mistake? And I'm just going to say, you will. We are all screwing up all the time. But we also have legacies of profound educational generosity. Musqueam, I have had so many examples of generosity from Musqueam friends and teachers, from my own friends and teachers in the nation, from my own family. You know, we're always going to screw up. We're not always going to cause harm. But we're not going to get it right all the time. We are inheritors of a very, very messy, problematic, painful context. And that means we're going to be part of a messy, painful, problematic process going forward. So as we're talking about, you know, when will we be ready, I think we also have to just understand that the mess is the point. And it's going to be messy. We're dealing with relationships, and relationships at their best are messy. At their worst, they're something, you know, even, you know, more challenging. But I think we have to get past the idea that we're going to get it right and approach it with the idea that we're going to do our very best and we're going to learn and we'll take correction where it comes. And for teachers, I think that means listen to your students, because our students have profound experiences in their classroom. I was just talking with students yesterday who are in a classroom with a teacher who ought to know better, who is doing all kinds of bullshit. And so we're going to have a conversation about that. I have students who correct me on things. If we make spaces where our students can actually bring their vulnerabilities and have their humanity recognized, we're going a long way toward reversing the weaponization of education in these spaces. But, you know, as everybody here has said, the labor is inequitable. We talk about mandatory courses, and I think there are really good reasons to have them, but my question always is, you know, and I think Larry's questions at the beginning were very important in setting us that context, you know, whose content, but also who does the labor, and to what end? Do we see a mandatory course as being the magic bullet that's going to solve all of our problems of racism in the classroom? Or do we see it as an engagement of relationship that makes possible different kinds of questions and different kinds of conversations? And are we going to invest in the capacity that's required to make these matter? Because if we're going to have a mandatory course and it's all the most vulnerable faculty who have to teach that, that's going to be a horrific experience for those faculty, and it's also going to be a horrific experience for the Indigenous students in that class. And it's going to be a terrible experience for the non-Indigenous students who are excited and now are in this place that is so vexed and hurtful that they don't want to have anything to do with Indigenous issues anymore. There's also a fundamental concern I have about the way in which these things get framed when people are really worried about making a mistake. I talked with a student last week who was told that she had told not to write about Indigenous characters in her work of any kind, with the implication being that people would be angry. And I think there's a fundamental concern about Indigenous anger, one that is deeply rooted in ideas of Indigenous savagery. The idea that if you screw up, somehow we're coming for you. I think that's a profoundly unjust presumption. I understand where people don't want to do harm, but I think we also have to interrogate that concern that if you don't get it right, somehow, you know, the Indigenous mafia is looking for you. Every Indigenous community I've been in has challenges. Every Indigenous community I've been in is profoundly generous. We all get that this is hard. It's no less hard for us. It's hard in different ways. But I think we have to interrogate our anxieties. Are those anxieties based on realities? Or are those anxieties based on really, really deep existential anti-Indigenousness that presumes that we only want to hear you say, you know, uniformly positive things, and if you deviate from a particular script, we're going to be angry? Well, that's not it. We're dealing with long histories of trauma, but we're also dealing with long histories of beauty. And Eve Tuck, who is a brilliant scholar, if you don't know her work, you need to, She writes beautifully in an essay called Suspending Damage about we have to get out of damage-centered narratives, not because we're not going to take up the difficult issues, but because the difficult issues are not the only things that represent who we are as Indigenous people. We need to take up all of the complexity of being human. Because it is still controversial in this country to say that Indigenous people are human. It's controversial in the legal system, it's controversial in the carceral system, it's controversial in a lot of educational spaces. That's a crazy bar that we're working with. So I think what we have to do is come to this with a lot of generosity for ourselves, for our students, and for one another. We have to come with a lot of openness. We have to come with a profound amount of humility. But we also, everybody here has talked about relationships. We have to remember we're part of a long history of relationships, some that have been very bad and some that have been more positive. So what is our responsibility in making those relationships better? Not to create some sort of idealized model, not to get rid of the mess, but to take the mess seriously. My last comment on this is if we're thinking about these issues of capacity, we also have to be investing in Indigenous students, because there aren't enough of us doing this work at the faculty and staff level. We need to make sure that our students not only have access, but have support and have encouragement to continue through to whatever degree that they want to. But we are so focused on cannibalizing other institutions for their Indigenous faculty that we have forgotten that we have to invest in generations of Indigenous student success to make sure that we have a lot more students who are sitting at these tables helping make these policy decisions, strengthening these relationships. And if we're not going to build capacity for Indigenous students, then we're cutting off any chance of long-term success. So I'll leave it there. I know there's a lot more to say, but I want to thank you and thank everybody for the comments.
So the first question that we had from the webinar, yours is one that's focusing on teaching assistants. So the question is, do TAs find themselves in a unique role that gives them an opportunity to integrate or expand conversations being had in the classroom? Also, the practical strategies might there be for TAs who are confined in a large degree by the professor in terms of context?
I didn't hear it. So the question was about teaching assistants?
Yeah. Capacity for teaching assistants and what their role is in this conversation.
Yeah. I guess I can jump in a little bit about that. Teaching assistants can often be in a really tricky situation, particularly if they're engaging with these issues in really meaningful ways and the professor may not be. That sets up a not so great situation. I know in our department we have a pretty extensive TA training process that students go through that includes the What I Learned in Class Today project that I know a lot of people here are aware of, that gives graduate teaching assistants opportunities to really think about how they can avoid doing harm in the classroom, and that's all based on undergrads' experiences here, including people who are in the room. I think the teaching assistant thing, I think in general, my experience as a graduate student was that I wasn't really taught to teach, I was just asked to teach. And so I think that's something that we really need to do more work with. I'm not sure what the answer is exactly, but the teaching assistants, particularly in large introductory classes where there may not be a lot of Indigenous content, just a bit, and so there's not necessarily the investment in the training, I think it's a really sticking point. So I don't know that I've got an answer for that, but I think to flag that as something maybe we need to be putting more resources toward.
Thank you. Anyone else want to answer?
How to teach?
The teaching assistants,
Like the
just how to
TAs?
support the TAs.
Oh. I don't know, our TAs, are community members in the language program that we teach. And we get them all the support we can with the cultural relevance connection to our languages our language that we're trying to teach, and get them engaged in trying to get them engaged in talking to students and tutoring them, and just getting them some background that in another room, giving them a cultural background, because some of our young people don't have the in-depth cultural knowledge from their families because of the disruption in community lives since Confederation. It's really quite a thing to do that. And I don't know how to do that with the TAs here in the university. It's very much like Cole said, I'm an automotive machinist. That's my indentured trade, rebuilding engines. And when we're talking about making mistakes, we work with tolerances like 1/10,000th of an inch. So if you got a hiccup that day, then you're going to mess up pretty fast. And making a mistake, if you make a mistake or don't know something, you have to be sure about that. Because I know in my trade, if there's something you don't know about, you become a liability. You become very unsafe to yourself and your coworkers. And all of a sudden somebody says, you really don't know what you're doing. And to me, that if you are not able to sit there and talk with the TA and say, I don't know about that, let's go research it together, find it out. And that gives the TA the support to have confidence to be able to have a study group and work with them. So that's the only way that we've been able to do it.
So we talked about challenges and responses, and challenges we raised were faculty engagement, integrating content. So we talked a lot about integrating context across programs versus one specific mandatory course. We talked about fear of failure, that we have to, many of us have this fear of failure, but we have to also learn how we learn from mistakes actually and teach our students about that also. Commitment from a higher level at the university or at faculty levels relates to funding, policies, actions, and most importantly, accountability. And that's probably going to be our question to the panel. And we also want, one of the challenges is creating space, because all programs, students, and faculty are busy as is and overstressed at the university. So how do you create space in order to allow people to add more things to their responsibility while making sure they're not more overstressed? Some of the responses we talked about is creating educational opportunities for faculty, and aim for systems change versus a band-aid solution, and then making sure that the responsibility is on all of us, so each of us is responsible to push the programs or to poke the people who need to make things, faculty association, UBC Central, and so forth. And most importantly is in order to so all of them remain accountable for the goals and actions that we're creating. So our question to the panel is, because we're concerned about the commitment for the higher level, is what's your experience with getting your leadership in supporting your efforts and encouraging accountability to the community?
I guess I'm just going to speak from the faculty of medicine perspective, my experience with it, and I really do get the sense that they're listening and they want to support and help. and they're learning how to listen. They don't always know how to action it. So we're in a place right now, for example, when they realize the magnitude of what is required, and sometimes it is small things, but the magnitude is a lot. We're asking to create a safe environment. I mean, if we have to aspire to an anti-racist and a safe environment for our Indigenous students. We have to. We have to aspire to a place, and so what does that require? It means staff training. It means academic faculty training. It means that, and the people to do that, to action that takes a bit. And then there are other directives. There's more than that. You have to do things at a multi-level place. So they need to model it. They need to show it. I mean, and I think part of the way it's shown is you have the dean talk about it, which he has with Elder Larry at the beginning of medical school, the importance of it, which is great. But at the other end of it, you have to be able to evaluate and assess it. And there needs to be some kind of report card. Students are talking about, let's have a report card. Let's assess how the faculty is doing on these things. I love the idea that the faculty is assessing, but the students are assessing too. That's amazing. So I'm wondering how we can actually integrate that rather than just an idea, but how do we actually do that? You know, there was an equity thing about students feeling unsafe I don't know, I probably shouldn't speak to that actually because I can't remember it exactly, but I know that because there's, you know, a dean of equity there and all of the instances of students feeling safe for a number of reasons. And I'm talking about safe and I'm differentiating that from feeling uncomfortable, right? Because we really need to talk about that and how that plays out. But anyway, I'm really interested in students actually assessing their learning environment and everyone that they work with. HK.
So I'll add to that, within the Faculty of Education, we have an Associate Dean of Indigenous Education, and I don't know if there are other units that have an Associate Dean of Indigenous issues or, so this is quite unique. And with that, there is a lot of support of our Indigenous faculty so that we don't feel so isolated. You know, sometimes we work in silos so often, even though our offices are right next door, but we try to meet on a monthly basis, and this is something that I've seen get better and better over time. In regards to that, we also have a unit strategic plan. I know many of the other units are also revising their strategic plan as well that speaks to Indigenous issues. So we have that commitment. I've mentioned the mandatory course, so EDU C440. So for, again, a long time, the secondary cohort of teacher candidates would register for the course and take the course towards the end of their program. And so because of these discussions that we've been having with other faculty who are teaching these courses, as well as the office staff themselves, as well as the students, there is a move to have all of the EDUs or all of the teacher candidates take this course up front at the beginning of their program. So that's really nice that we have that support. And more recently, we've had a few positions that's within the larger Faculty of Education as well as Educational Studies that is looking for positions in Indigenous education, so Indigenous advancement and Indigenous teacher education. So these are some of the ways within the last few years that we've seen some movement, but there's still so much more that needs to be done.
I have a follow-up question on the last one, so I hope it's okay to kind of go sideways. But in thinking about your point about teacher training and academic training and this idea that in the medical profession it's really important to create safe space and also in the educational field, do you think there's a training that exists that could potentially be used for faculty or instructors at UBC specifically? Do you think the SANOS training would be appropriate for faculty to take?
So there is a MOOC. What does MOOC stand for? Massive online, massive open online course. Mahalo. Thank you, collective here. But I don't remember the exact title, but it's, I believe, reconciliation.
I don't know if it's reconciliation, but I know the MOOC in the sense that there's a half a dozen speakers on that talking about Indigenous relevance and culture from different Aboriginal groups within British Columbia. So, and it's giving all of the cultural protocols that we could remember. I'm one of the participants on there, and it was just talking about what can we do. The questions were asked. They couldn't hear the questions, so we just did the answers on there. But I can't remember all the questions that were there. It's been a while, and but I know it's been quite successful. It's a non-credit course. It's for free, but you've got there's only a certain amount that are accepted onto it right as they register. And the feedback I've gotten from some of our community members have taken that up, and it's an amazing course because there's so much cultural relevance in there for the students to be picking up. It's quite successful as far as I understand. Yeah.
So I just looked it up. It's Reconciliation Through Indigenous Education. So this course was designed by our current Associate Dean of Indigenous Education, Dr. Jan Hare. And I think it's being offered right now, and there's been thousands of participants. And so when we think of the change in curriculum within the K-12 system in BC, we know that many of the seasoned teachers haven't had an opportunity to take a course like EDUC 440 or haven't had professional development. So this is one of those courses that allows whether they're instructors here at UBC or teachers to get that kind of training. But this is just one step. This is not a course where you learn all there is to know, right?
For that, we have to take your summer course.
Yes, right. In 4 weeks.
I think one of the things that comes up for me with that question of how faculty might learn more is how, to be frank, how to incentivize that for faculty, especially ones who aren't primarily in these areas of inquiry to begin with, because we're under such pressure to do so many things all the time. And to think of the sort of continuing education model for faculty, I would like to have a longer conversation sometime about what would that look like and how would we make that appealing to faculty who are already stretched really thin.
Thank you, and I think that I'm going to weigh in here. I think in relation to that, I'm thinking about, that's when I mentioned the leadership question, is that we really need the deans and associate deans and all the way on up to say that if you're going to take some time to do these things, to learn how to teach in a way, or to take courses, workshops with CTLT, that they recognize that as something that is, more than just your own professional development, more than just service, actually, a real value to the units that they teach in. So you can put more pressure on that, on leadership for that.
I also, at the center, we've developed this Indigenous cultural safety curriculum, which follows upon the curriculum that's not what Sanyas has created, but there is a cultural competency curriculum for or cultural safety curriculum for anyone in the health professions that they can access, and they get credit for it. So anyone that's a health professional has access to training as a starting place. And of course, these are only just starting places about, as you've talked about, and Daniel, we've all talked about the starting place for the relationships. So there's nothing stopping faculty to having book clubs and journal clubs and discussion groups and things like that to support them in this journey and inviting people along. So I guess if there's ways to, for the faculty to buy lunch for people, for faculty or something to be able to come to these discussions, like incentivize, find ways to do that. I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
So we were wondering about the potential necessity for mandatory critical whiteness and critical settler studies, and how that may or may not alleviate the burden on Indigenous faculty, because you could have non-Indigenous professors teaching this, and what your thoughts were around that.
Let me say this. 1998, I was coerced into signing up as a UBC student in the First Nations Languages program, and the person that was teaching it, while I was on council, had negotiated this program, and she was the teacher. Now, I want to say something else before I get into that. When we talk about the MOOC and relationships and teaching and learning, we have a saying, we have a teaching. When you're invited to come to this big house to participate in this function, whatever it is, hang up your differences outside the door. Hang up your preconceived notions of each other outside the door. Come into this building with an open heart and an open mind and get the work done. Okay? So if you've been taught that since childhood, you sit in a room with people that you don't like, but you get the work done. You sit in a room where people would like to chuck you out the door. You get the work done. So, the question at that time was, what is this white woman doing teaching us our language? And I said, I really don't care who she is. You know what? She knows more about my language than I do. I want to learn what she has to offer. And she's still teaching me 20 years down the road because she can analyze language like I can't. She can tell me things that my mother couldn't tell me about our language. And to me, that if we hang up our differences outside the door in every classroom, regardless of who that person is, as long as that person has the correct information to pass on to you, it should not make a difference. And I say that from my side, and I've never had that problem of that's not an Indigenous woman. So our FNIS suffers from that. We had a research person spend 20 some odd years with Musqueam researching in her master's and PhD. And when we sat on the selection committee, they said, no, we can't select this person. It's a non-Indigenous person. I said, but she is one of the most knowledgeable people I know that has the history of our people. Very much like today, our director of our archival department that UBC wished they could have is not Indigenous. And every person in our council, in our lead administrative roles, they go to him. Let's hear it. Well, I need to know about this. Quick, can you pull it up? Tell me, show me where it is. Show me the material. And it's a non-Indigenous person. They've hung up their differences outside the door to get the work done. And I know you're going to make mistakes. I think I made 1 million mistakes in the 4 years of indentured apprenticeship. But for every mistake, you learn a lesson if you're paying attention. And it's only if you're paying attention and if you're responsible to that task that you have to do and responsible to the protocol and yourself. Your own responsibility to learn as much as you can about whatever it is that you're going to pass on. Doesn't matter who you are. When we were kids, the most astounding person I ever heard was a Ukrainian guy with a Ukrainian English accent speaking Hunt Kamina because he was living with a Hunt Kamina speaking woman. It was amazing. So to me that's, and I know we do have issues, our communities have issues, but then that's carrying on the teachings of the Indian residential school, the teachings of the Canadian government that there is a hierarchy, a social hierarchy. There is no social hierarchy. When it comes to learning, you learn from whoever is the best. And I think that's where we need to have that understanding with our students and our faculty. If you're going to teach something, you better learn about it. Every bit that you can. And be respectful to your Indigenous students. And I think it'll work myself, but that's how I feel about knowledge passing. It's not important who the other person is. It's important that they have some knowledge that you are looking for. So that's my answer to that.
I'm mindful of time, so I wanted to put a question in that was about students. We were talking about students. The question is a little bit stunted, so I'm going to try to translate a bit, is about how to encourage students to continue their learning after the quote-unquote course has ended. How do we cultivate a conversation to engage further so that students, when they leave our classrooms, continue to think about the things that we might be teaching them?
Yeah, sure. I think so the idea of continuing learning after the class is over has almost everything to do, I think, with the environment you created in the classroom in the first place. So this summer I took a group of 16 students with Tanya Bob to London. And we're still having reunions from that experience, partially because it was really traumatic for many people in the class. But I also try to really, again, it's about those relationships that we've been talking about. It's really gratifying to me to, run into a student 2 years later and they're still hanging out with students that they met in one of my classes. But that has to do with the environment we create. And to have that maybe as a goal, it might not be in the syllabus, but we're trying to build community, really, I think. At least that's what I'm trying to do. Communities who will support each other doing this work that is so urgent. And And I also try at the end of most of my classes to give a kind of for further reading, or here's where to go next, because obviously we can't do everything in a single class. So here's the music you should listen to if we haven't already, or here's some other books to read or films to see or other courses to take, and so on, and show the students that they have just scratched the surface, and that this is a lifelong and really exciting thing to be engaged in. And it's, and to also model enthusiasm for it as well, I think is really critical. No matter how hard or difficult the material is to, try to, some days you have to really generate it. But to be enthusiastic, to kind of, I joke with my students that we like to sort of geek out about this stuff. And you create that kind of energy that can carry after the class.
Well, I think a lot of the major part of learning is after class, when you get into open discussion and about different little issues that may seem insignificant, but sometimes the simplest question ends up being 3, 4, 5 hours of talking and learning. And also, to me, it's like yesterday at lunchtime, the young student from Applied Sciences was talking about cleanup, the oolican oil that he learned up in Comox. And I thought, okay, I asked the question and he answered, but I could see that he wasn't complete. But then I thought, well, it's lunchtime, we'll leave it alone and talk to him afterward. And I said, there's been a study 10, 15 years back 10 or 15 years about oolican. There's a publication about it, and I said, you know what? We tried to put a moratorium as Musqueam people in the 1990s, put a moratorium on oolican fishing in the river. DFO said, you don't have any archived material. You don't have any scientific research documents. And we said, well, we know by experiences this is happening. And from our years and generations of it. But that young fella said, oh, I didn't know that. I said, no, you wouldn't have known that because they probably don't have that documented in marine biology. So it was put forward that way. So he, just in that little discussion, he got a whole bunch of stuff that he ends up going to look for. But to me, that's what happens after class.
I just want to acknowledge and honor that too. And I guess when we talk about what happens after class, it's all of the structures and that we create, or what we call the hidden curriculum. That's what happens after class, how people talk about it, how faculty, how other students are talking about it. All of those things can undermine the curriculum. And so I don't know the response to that other than just acknowledging that that's true, and that's absolutely true, and that, you know, the evidence base and where that sits and how that's validated. So I just wanted to acknowledge that's the other thing that's happening, right?
Let's keep talking.
So we've got a few thank you gifts for our panelists. And so once again, we're going to send you off in a good way. Hope you enjoyed today's event. Thank you again to the panelists. We have so much gratitude for everything. And have a great day, everyone.